good afternoon, or evening, or morning, or whenever. Normally, I try to keep these things pretty to the point. They're pretty one-off videos. They're nothing you can't get out of the book if you're willing to put in a little bit more time than the video will take to do it. As a result, I kind of do it as a one-off. I press record, I use a cheap little microphone, and I just talk. This is nothing more elaborate than a PowerPoint. Nothing fancy. But this one needs something more. This one needs a story. I want to tell you about a kid named Lily. She graduated a few years ago, 2015, I want to say. Lily was a sweet kid. She was a really sweet kid. Did pretty well in the class. A little flighty sometimes, but yeah, who isn't when they're 18? I was. Oh, God. Anyway, when I get to the end of this class, I always try to do two things. And they're always right on my mind when I get into those last 3 or 4 weeks of the term, of the second term of the course. And that is, I want to know what I did wrong. I want to know what to change. I want to know what was poorly paced, maybe what could have been read at home, which I gave time in class in, or what was too easy, what was too hard, what too much time. What aspects of the essay were problematic, what aspects of the essay were easy, that kind of thing. And I've actually changed my essays many times over the years. Every year there's some change in the essay and in the course description and whatever, in terms of getting the material to you. And this kid at the end, in person, when I asked everybody in person, what did I do wrong? Please help me, let me know. She raises her hand and she says, class was great. I only have one comment, and that is there wasn't really much opportunity for creative writing. And I felt a little guilty about that. Even though this is a course on academic writing, I'm not teaching creative writing. I'm teaching how to write with a purpose, with a structure. She has a good point. And it was kind of adorable when she wrote the eval for the university at the end. She even wrote in the what could I do better kind of thing. She wrote, you know who this is. This is Lily. Here's what I think you should do. And it stuck with me. It really did. And as a result, every time I teach this course since her, I try to put descriptive writing a little bit earlier, because descriptive writing is the purpose for those of you who like creative writing. And quite frankly, it's the purpose for everybody who wants to develop their voice into an essay that's going to get not only a good grade, but also a decent audience. Because good writing, or any writing at all, is something that should be enjoyed, it should be read, and if it's boring and it lacks descriptive detail, it tends to not be read. And that's where you get the lower grades, that's where you get the lower audience, that's where you have work to do. And that's not the goal of the class. The goal of the class is for you to develop yourselves as strong writers, and that's why we're doing descriptive writing. So, as a basic definition, description is a purpose that you use to tell readers about the physical characteristics of a person, a place, or a thing. I'm going to be honest with you, I don't see description that often compared to many of these other purposes as a primary focus for an essay. I do, however, see it as a purpose which is blended into larger ideas, such as, for example, a cause-effect essay in order to punch up the writing. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Descriptive writing can absolutely exist. I'm going to walk you through how to create a descriptive essay. But the bigger thing that I want you to get out of this is how to envelop these descriptive ideals into your own writing. So if you're, for example, making a persuasive argument, you can still use description as a purpose. You use it within your writing in order to make people interested. What's the point of saying this character ran when you could say this character shot up the stairs? It's a little more interesting. It relies on the 5 senses: sight, hearing, smell, touch, and taste. If you remember your fiction back in freshman year, you'll remember your imagery, and that's essentially what you're creating. You're creating images. Now, there are a couple of types of description, of course. The first is the objective description, and it focuses on the object itself. You don't worry about your personal reactions to it. Your purpose is to create a precise, literal picture of your object. So a lot of writing situations do require exact descriptions of apparati or conditions, and in these cases your goal is to construct a picture for your audience. You're going to see a lot of this for you non-humanities majors. A lot of descriptive writing where your purpose is going to be less about creating an argument, more about telling your professor this is what this looks like. This is the literal objective idea of what this thing is. If you're a biologist, you describe what you see through a microscope. If you're a historian, you describe a Civil War battleground, and you would write objectively. The biologist wouldn't, talk about how exciting his observations were, and the historian wouldn't say how disappointed he was at the outcome of the battle. None of that matters. A lot of newspaper reporters try to achieve this kind of objectivity, and writers of technical reports, scientific papers, certain types of business correspondence also require this quite a bit. Objectivity is an ideal that writers strive for, but you don't fully achieve. So sometimes selecting some details and leaving out others, you make some subjective decisions, obviously. Sometimes it's accompanied by visuals, diagrams, or photographs. The visual never introduces new material. It's just about describing and showing what is described. If you are, for example, aiming for objectivity when you describe what the Globe Theater looked like, maybe you'll introduce a diagram or a schematic of the Globe Theater is to kind of visualize what you're looking at. Of course, subjective description, it's going to be a little more interesting in terms of depending on what you're looking at, because it's your personal experience. Subjective description conveys your own response to your subject. Your perspective is not stated explicitly. You never say, this is my perspective, because that's lazy, and God, we don't want to be lazy. It instead reveals indirectly through your choice of words and your phrasing. You may have seen some of this subjective description last year, for those of you who might have read the Christopher Columbus or the John Smith narratives leading of their first contact with native peoples. I still remember one word that John Smith used to describe a native person coming up to meet with him the first time. He'd never seen a native person before, and he used the word skulked. That word skulked is a horrifyingly negative connotation, and it is very inhuman, and it's a subjective description. It reveals his point of view. He doesn't say his point of view, but it reveals his point of view, and that is that he sees them as inhuman. One of many reasons why John Smith was a horrifying human being. You rely on word connotations, those emotional associations. So going all the way back to that freshman year writing, quote, sandwiches, yeah. What are the connotations of a word? What are some synonyms for a word that you're using that might be more precise for what image or what feeling you're trying to convey? This might include a lot of little tricks that we're going to get to right now. Those tricks are striking phrases, language, figures of speech, your wonderful poetic language that you might have remembered from before, similes, metaphors, personifications, allusions. So let's look at those figures of speech, shall we? The first, of course, the simile. Then we have the metaphor, personification, and symbolism, and allusions. Ooh. Now, there are some very obvious similarities between descriptive writing and creative writing, which means that we can use these principles in writing descriptive essays to also analyze creative writing. And that's going to be something that you've got some experience with. So we're only going to spend a little bit of time in terms of analyzing creative writing. I'm more interested in us creating descriptive writing. So, for example, if I'm going to use a simile, you remember what a simile is, right? Like or as. Maybe I will say something like, instead of this event made Miss Darlene happy, you would say instead, this event that you've already talked about earlier in your claim has made her happy as a clam. Yes, that's a silly way of wording, but you get the idea. Or maybe you'd use a metaphor. Maybe if you want to convey a sort of brave disposition to a person that you're writing about, you would create this metaphor of a lion, compare this person to a very leonine characteristics. You could also personify things. The wind whispered, the engine died. Or you could allude to other more obvious ideas, to other more deeper ideas. Let's say you're doing a research essay about somebody and you are talking about the futility of what they're doing. Maybe you would point to them as being very Napoleonic in their positions, which is, of course, an allusion to the Emperor Napoleon. If you remember back, for those of you who chose this option for that second blog, Letter from Birmingham Jail, Martin Luther King uses his argument. He very much enriches that argument by alluding to various biblical passages and proverbs, and he expects his audience to be familiar with it. So, in analysis of descriptive writing, you're analyzing all those little ideas and all those beautiful images. It's devoted to analyzing the same word choice in order to understand how and why the author is choosing the language you choose to create a larger idea. So, let's talk about planning. I'm going to require you to write one short descriptive essay for me. And after that point, it's up to you. This is one of those times when an implied thesis is very useful. Now, there are multiple types of theses. One in which you are very familiar with, which is the thesis statement. There's also a thesis question, which we'll get to next term. And then there's the implied thesis. It's about saying what you need to say without saying it. I know, right? Writers of a descriptive essay will use an implied thesis when they describe a person, place, or a thing, and it allows them to convey the essay's point subtly through a selection and arrangement of details. Rather than saying the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment and ought to be stopped, if you were to take that a more descriptive route, maybe you would have an implied thesis in which you go through the descriptive details of sitting in that chair waiting for the chemicals to go into your veins, and the icy cold feeling in the pit of your stomach as you face your maker. You still get the same idea across. Your word choice is what gets it across. And once we have gone through descriptive writing, you may absolutely use an implied thesis whenever you want. The purpose of an implied thesis is to create instead a singular dominant impression. It's the mood or the quality that's emphasized in the writing that you're looking at. When you do this, your thesis might just be a statement of the dominant impression. Sometimes your thesis might go further and make a point about that dominant impression. Now, when we're looking at planning the essay, for example, as we do later in the student example, we start looking at things like... The sample was a guy named James Greggs for a sociology class, and the assignment that he had was to write a description of the service learning project that he participated in. So he had an implied thesis. His first paragraph does not have a thesis statement within it. He does say, I, along with some classmates, added a deck to the trailer, but he created a dominant impression, which I highly recommend you look at. I also recommend for this chapter that you look at the grammar and context. We will be spending a little bit of time on misplaced and dangling modifiers later on, but misplaced modifiers are something to keep an eye on because it can disrupt descriptive writing, and it can also lead to unclear interpretations from your reader. And you never want your reader to make an interpretation that you haven't made first. Please look at them. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was a whole 13 minutes long. How about that? I'm going to bed.